Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Ian Kavat. Here you can see China's first passenger jet, the C919, at its International Air Show debut in Singapore, some 15 years in the works. This type of single-aisle, narrow-body plane commands 60% of the world's passenger fleet, currently dominated by Airbus and Boeing. For decades, Beijing hasn't been able to build its own passenger jet. So how did China develop this plane? With us to discuss this are John Eastwood, Eiger Law Senior Partner, Tony Hu, former US Department of Defense Senior Director for China, Taiwan and Mongolia, and Stephen Tan, International Policy Advisory Group Managing Director. A very warm welcome to all of you on the show today. China currently buys more than 90% of its aircraft from Europe's Airbus and the US's Boeing. And over the next 20 years, that Chinese market is forecast to overtake the United States as the world's biggest market for air travel, in a world where global passenger traffic will double by 2040. At the Singapore Air Show in February, Beijing declared the C919 the first homegrown Chinese passenger jet, naming it a source of national pride. But experts say up to 60% of the Chinese state-owned Comac, or Commercial Aircraft Corporation of China, the plane's components are a result of deals with America's top aerospace companies. Tony, let me come to you first. So can China say that this plane is homegrown?
Well, that's a little bit overblown, because if you look at what China made, they made the fuselage, the wing, the exterior of the aircraft, but everything else that allowed the aircraft to fly are foreign sourced. For example, the engine, CFM, is a joint venture between the United States and the French.
But would this not be the case with Boeing and Airbus anyway?
Boeing and Airbus, yes, they all have foreign components, but it's a very small percentage. So China, on the other hand, the C919, on the other hand, if you look at the engine and the fuel system that allow the engine...
Why don't we take a look at the diagram that we've got here?
Actually, what China made was the fuselage, the body itself, and the wing. But everything else that allows the aircraft to fly is foreign sourced. Engine, for example, CFM is a US and French joint venture, and the fuel system is US system. The flight control that allows the pilot to control the airplane is also US source. Instrument panel, plus the entire back end in the fuselage, the passengers, for example, the entertainment system, the whole passenger seating area, the communication system, the aircraft communication system, navigation system, everything that allows that airplane to fly is foreign sourced. The landing gear, the wheels are all US, so that the aircraft can actually move on the ground. The tires French, Michelin. So to say it's homegrown, it's kind of like China saying a bottle of California wine is made in China, while the bottle might be made in China, but the wine inside is made in California. Same type of concept. So the outside, yes, it's made in China. Everything that goes in is made by foreign companies.
Okay, just a quick question. Companies that basically will be able to manufacture planes, Mitsubishi in Japan, UAC in Russia. So you expect that if they say that they have a homegrown plane, then that proportion of foreign parts should be round about how much?
Actually, in Japan, it's about 35% or so. It's definitely below 50%. In China's case, it's over 60%. And truly, it's only on some critical parts. And when I say this percentage, many of them is joint venture actually being manufactured in Japan. Technology might be coming from foreign source. So Japanese has very strong industrial base, and actually the recent Japanese regional jets, some components actually came from Taiwan, AIDC. AIDC produces portion of those aircraft. They based on the quality and cost and decides what foreign portion make the most sense for them to adapt.
Okay. Chinese spy Yanjun Xu was jailed for 20 years in the US for attempted economic espionage and theft of aviation trade secrets, as well as 2 related counts of conspiracy. Now, Xu was a deputy director of China's Ministry of State Security. Let me come to you, Stephen. What is the MSS? What does it do?
Well, MSS is Ministry of State Security which is a cabinet level department for ministry, looking at nothing but, national security, spying in and out.
So the equivalent of the CIA
Well,
in the US?
I think no. I think it's more than that. I think it's 10 times or maybe 20, 30 times of the combination of all the agencies equivalent. But the point is that this is the long-lasting organization ever since. But for the past few years, the power and the mandate of MSS get escalated to a point of the highest point. If you look at the word security, or the characters 安全 versus the word development, or the characters 发展. For the past few years under Xi's leadership, you can see that the characters or words of security or 安全 outweighs substantially the number of the characters or the words that's shown in various different reports as 发展 or development. That gives you a very clear idea that at this moment, the security, particularly state security, as defined by making sure that there is no subversive forces within mainland China, continue to be the highest, the ultimate goals of China. So as I just mentioned earlier, the power and mandate of MSS, or the Ministry of State Security, has never been higher than before, and then it outweighs other departments or the ministries.
Okay, so incredibly powerful department, cabinet level in China. John, what were Xu's goals and tactics? He was basically heading up a cell, wasn't he, in terms of trying to carry out espionage and steal trade secrets?
Yeah, I mean, there was a mixture of tactics that he was using. So you have these hacker groups like APT40 setting up a front group. You have Turbine Panda, for several years trying to reach these into these companies that were making these sensitive aviation technologies, especially Safran and GE, and that turned out to be exactly where Xu was pointed at. So. In terms of that being a priority for Comac, that linked him back to the C919 program. And the techniques were a combination of these hacking efforts with the human intelligence aspects of reaching out to engineers within GE, reaching out to people who were in the U.S. military. And, if you're a Chinese citizen living in the United States, working for one of these companies, it was very clear from after Xu was arrested that he had all the information on these people's families. He had an awful lot of information on his phone about what he was trying to go after and the people, their lives, their whole past history. And I think maybe one of the big mysterious things, of course, is that he somehow put his own MSS resume on his phone. So when he got caught, of course, it was a very rare look into an intelligence officer's career.
And so that was interesting, though, wasn't it? Because as we saw from the picture, the C919's engine technology was from the two companies that you mentioned, Safran and GE.
That's exactly what they're going after. Yeah.
So it's interesting that they bought that part, but then at the same time they were attempting to steal the IP. Is that right?
Right. It's like I want to find out how you make it. I want to find out how those fins work on the engine, those composite fins. I really want. I mean, it became as the course of the correspondence was taken over by the FBI. It became very clear that this was what he was after. This very specific aspect, which relates to the fuel economy and the reliability of the engines.
So interesting. So Tony, sort of to get the prototype itself, pull it apart, and then anything that you can't work out, you try to steal.
So what he has contributed is China is testing right now the CJ1008 engine, which is a copy of the CFM Leap engine. the LEAP engine is 6 foot 6 inches opening. The one that China built, said, oh, it was different. It's 6 feet 5 inches, 1 inch shorter. And the length is also 1 inch shorter. And they say this is a different engine, but actually, if you look at the design. So he was able to obtain sufficient technical information to allow China to basically copy the LEAP engine. And this engine, the CJ1000A, will be used in future C919 jets. So by the time the United States government caught him, he has passed on sufficient information. And for China, you know, to obtain technology, prohibited technology, some of them, it's through joint venture. When U.S. companies go to China try to have joint venture, sometimes they're coerced in transferring technology.
Stephen, how significant do you think this arrest was? Tony went on to say that a lot of the information he believes Xu had was actually passed on. Obviously, Xu was the first MSS officer to be arrested.
Well, the arrest was made in early 2018. Remember that was the time in the beginning of the awareness in the United States and the West that the economic espionage activities by China in the rest of the world, and then someone needs to have a hardcore evidence to bring along the case to be adjudicated, indicted, and convicted in the court of law. And that was exactly the manifest of the espionage activities proven and eventually convicted in the court of law and in the eyes of the general public. So remember, at that time, it was the beginning of the era, 2018, 2019, and I think people started to be more aware
that it wasn't a peaceful rise by China.
Exactly.
Right.
So we look at it, I still remember that back then we looked very closely into the espionage Act, Economic Espionage Act of 1996 to see whether this is sufficient or anything else that we can add on. And the court looked at this, and the other countries, particularly including Taiwan and Japan and South Korea, and all we look at this, our existing laws and practices to see there is any gap. So I think the significance of that case back then is that in the beginning of the era where China started, the rest of the world started to prove that, to demonstrate that those illegal activities have been conducted in China and by China over the years, and then to raise the awareness that this can no longer be the case.
Okay, so evidence that this espionage was completely state-backed. Okay, now let's go to the U.S. ambassador to China, Nicholas Burns, and a recent interview on CBS's 60 Minutes where he talks about the fears of U.S. businesses based in China.
There is still intellectual property theft from American companies here.
Is every American company afraid of that?
Yes.
Tony, so let me come to you. So what strategies, other than, let's talk about human intelligence, operations, for example, what Xu was doing, as well as the hacking that John mentioned, what other strategies are used by China to steal from these companies?
China basically used 4 different strategies. One is joint venture, so that when you want to invest in China, sometimes they coerce you into giving up your technology, your information, your intellectual property. Another way is foreign direct investment in the United States. So they often buy companies on the technology that they need. So the United States has a committee on foreign investment in U.S. CFIUS. They're very busy reviewing this, and this is an interagency committee that's hosted by Department of Treasury, and Department of Defense has a equity in it. So especially on dual-use technology, they will consult with the United States Department of Defense. When I was the senior director of managing China, I often get consulted on certain technologies, whether we can allow China to invest in a company that makes this thing. So there's another method for them to get technology. Another thing that few people knows is they have a lot of people checking U.S. patent offices, because U.S. patent offices, it's open. Somebody apply for a patent, they post it, and sometimes even got graphics. So they study this new stuff, and they steal it. Finally, of course, as we said, using spy or cyber activities to either physically steal it or through cyber. In the computer, they take it and steal things. So this is how they obtain many of the technologies.
Okay. John, you're working actually in this sphere, in IP law. You tell us more about China's practices and essentially what's going on here.
Well, yeah, I mean, as Tony said, it's there's this thing about joint ventures. It's a key way of squeezing foreign companies into partnering up with local companies to get you to do to transfer technology, and you basically end up teaching your competitors how to do the things that you do. Along the way, you also have a lot of companies who are just manufacturing in China will also discover that a lot of their former employees and former managers in China will depart and go down the street and found another company or go to a competitor to help them set up their department. Another key role, I think, and this we see in the Xu case, is this whole thing of universities. So in the United States, of course, universities are hotbeds of R&D and technology development, and they often have laboratories that have been sponsored by major US companies. And in China, what you have is a state-sponsored university system in which you have these invitations come from people like Xu, and that went to the GE fellow, David Zhang. And the way that he got in trouble, the way that this all kind of broke in the open is that the GE employee told his company that he was going to go visit family in China. He didn't disclose that he was going to go speak at a university in Nanjing. And this connection, this whole thing, if you were a US company, if you're a technology company, if you're a defense company, you find out that your employees are going to go lecture at some university in China, that's a warning bell.
Okay. Stephen, we mentioned joint ventures, that with China you are forced to train or transfer technology. But in terms of international practice, how does it work? Is there always going to be a certain amount of that going on in any country? What happens in Taiwan, for example?
Right. But as far as I know, the international practices in this field, including the joint venture, joint development, technology transfer, you need to have the waterproof transaction documents to be fully executed, and parties, have the obligation to go through the terms of the transaction documents and all that. Many believe that it is extremely difficult, if it's not entirely impossible, to do that in China or with the Chinese counterparts. We're not talking about the economic espionage activities. We're talking about sort of the formalistic joint venture, that type of entities, or the transactional structure, where if you find it not being able to be fully enforceable and having difficult time of going by the book.
So you're saying that basically you just don't follow the rule of law, you just don't follow what's in the contract. Well, that's the biggest difference.
Well, that could be the biggest impediment, along with the espionage activities and all that.
Okay. John, would you like to add it, as this is your expertise?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of companies, they jumped into this willingly. They wanted to get a piece of the China market share. It's a huge market. And for aircraft, it's a big deal because they've got 1.4 billion people they need to move around from place to place. And the trains can't take everyone all the time. And so what you have is this desire to make money. You see it in renewable energy. You see it in so many other areas where people have gone in with big, grand ideas and then basically just handed off the market to somebody else and went out empty-handed. So this happens over and over again.
Okay, Tony?
Yeah, if I may, this is personal experience and might be a good indication of why China do this. About almost 20 years ago, I was in a party in China, and this topic of industrial theft came up. And a Chinese gentleman, a very senior guy, said, if American company don't protect their stuff, why blame us? It's your own fault. the fact that we got it. You cannot blame up that just because you don't protect it well enough. I think that's the mentality. Anybody who deal with China probably would agree with me.
So that it's fair game.
Exactly. They say, just like saying if a thief breaks into your house, it's your fault because you didn't make the lock better.
Now, Boeing is in crisis. In January this year, part of the wall of an Alaska Airlines Boeing 737 MAX detached in midair shortly after taking off. The flight was carrying 177 passengers, and miraculously, none of them was hurt or killed. But 6 years ago, 364 people did die in 2 Boeing 737 MAX crashes within a span of 5 months, first off the coast of Indonesia in October 2018, and then in Ethiopia in March 2019. Now, the C919 represents an economic challenge to the US because if it edges Boeing out of China, that's a loss of an annual market Boeing estimates at $1.5 trillion in 20 years. Stephen, with Boeing struggling and a global shortage of jets, is it not a good time to have another challenger in this market?
Well, there are 2 aspects of, or 2 different ways of looking at this issue. One is purely from the business and commercial perspective. It's a pure commercial competition, Boeing versus Airbus versus, China, whereas C919. But then you have to add a certain element or the perspective of looking at this to see that whether there exists certain amount of unfair practices, including what we just talked about, trade secrets, espionage activities, illegal transactions, and so on and so forth. So I would suspect that there will be a combination of commercial competitions head to head at one hand, and some escalated legal investigations and the scrutinies on the latter issue that I just mentioned, and both were hand in hand on that particular subject or issue with respect to C919.
Okay, John, so the message there, it needs to be fair competition. A challenger, I think that's what Stephen was saying, should not be stealing the technology or IP from other countries. What would you say are the advantages for China's global airspace ambitions at this time, as well as the setbacks?
Well, that's the thing. It's really not easy to compete in aviation, and countries have tried to have vanity projects around cars. Indonesia and various other countries have tried to have their own self-built cars. But aviation's a whole other thing because, you've got, it's up in the air. If it crashes, that's hundreds of people's lives. It's not just about being able to, quote unquote, make a plane. It's about the legacy costs of when you have it in your fleet, you're going to have 20 years or more of that plane being there. There's going to be the fuel costs, the fuel efficiency, the safety, making it easier to maintain. All of these things are hard to engineer, and they're the very fine things that make a critical advantage for the companies that have done it. So Airbus did not have this success overnight. It took them decades to get where they are, to be a leading competitor to Boeing and McDonnell Douglas and other kind of major makers. And the truth is that for China to take this giant leapfrog over all of that R&D that was legitimately done by just taking it, that's a theft on a level of billions and billions and billions, tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars.
Yeah, and the hard work of essentially a whole industry, almost a whole industry there. Tony, do you want to very briefly tell us about some of the other setbacks in terms of maybe certification?
Absolutely. Right now, for China to try to sell these aircraft to airlines who wants to fly to the United States or Europe, Europe and the United States FAA and Europe's CASA has to certify it that it's safe to fly. There's just not enough data to say this is safe, and there's not enough data for insurance company who's willing to insure the aircraft for operation in these dense populated areas.
But why is there no data?
Because this aircraft's too new. Plus, it doesn't have a historic testing, because as Boeing tests their airplane from 737 the original 100, 200 series all the way up to 737 MAX. That is almost 50 years, 40 years of data as they modify the aircraft. Same thing with the Airbus, A320, A321, A319, same. So these are, so once they're certified, then they're even operating more. The more data comes in, the more safety information becomes available, what China has now. Now, before Comac made C919, they made an aircraft called ARJ21. It's a 70 aircraft regional jet. It's also now certified. Even it started flying in 2016. Right now, the only foreign country who's willing to take a risk is Indonesia. So even after all this year, there's just not enough data, because when you steal things, you cannot show proof that this component was installed in this airplane, have flown 3,000 hours and safe. So I think that's the obstacle that China has. Obviously, the aircraft is cheaper. That's attraction portion.
Half of the price, apparently.
Right, it's cheaper upfront cost, but nobody knows about their reliability, their life cycle cost. So it's also a question for aircraft industry, airline industry, trying to figure out, is it worth it?
Okay. John Eastwood, Tony Hu, and Stephen Tan, thank you so much for joining the show today.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching the show today. Stay safe and see you next time.